quieter portions of the event. Today it is our great pleasure to have Vojislava Kordes with us today to talk about her most recent book on sanctuary cities. Vojislava teaches comparative politics, comparative urban policy at Columbia in SIPA, and she previously taught at John Jay of the City University of New York. And she holds PhD in urban
At
planning.
Queens College and Hunter College, so.
Wow.
Yes.
So she previously taught all over CUNY.
Yes.
Excellent. She has a PhD in urban planning. She was previously the Paul E. Rather Postdoctoral Fellow in Urban and Global Studies at Trinity College and a research associate to the late Benjamin Barber at the Urban Consortium, which is up at Fordham, right?
Yes.
Yes. She's the author of New York in the Cinematographic Imagination, The Agitated City, which came out in 2020, and more recently, The Politics of Sanctuary, which we're going to be hearing more about today. She is published on cosmopolitanism, on the politics of recognition, planning intervention, social reform, anti-urban bias, the right to the city, and the right to sanctuary. In addition, although those are the topics that we might touch upon today, I should note that she's written extensively on film and the filmic depictions of the urban experience. Before undertaking doctoral research, Professor Kordes worked at the Pratt Institute for Community and Environmental Development in Brooklyn. So, please join me in welcoming Professor Kordes back to CUNY.
Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm actually more used to being in the audience here, and I hope that my presentation will reflect what I have learned from being in the audience here over many years. I also wanted to ask you how many of you have at least glanced at my book, read maybe a chapter. That's great. I hope that the presentation will enhance that experience. And for those who haven't read the book, I hope that it will inspire you to read it. So this presentation.
To purchase it.
Yes, well, let's not be capitalist. Paying the book to colleagues, at least somehow we can share a copy. So this presentation will focus on the lessons learned from my study of sanctuary activism in New York during the first Trump administration. Given that I'm an urbanist and urban planner by training, I will start and end, perhaps predictably, with the CUNY Graduate Center professor David Harvey's intellectually provocative notion of rebel cities. Harvey has asked whether the city can be a center of revolution, no less, highlighting the role of social movements which have used the city as an agent of social and political innovation in the search to construct an alternative social order and a different sense of the right to the city. The key question for sanctuaries is, as phrased by Derrida, could the city, equipped with the new rights and greater sovereignty, open up new horizons of possibility previously undreamt of by international state law? If this is the question for sanctuaries, at stake then are city-state dynamics. For this topic, Tilly's edited volume Cities and the Rise of States in Europe and Tilly's Coercion, Capital and European States represent particularly valuable contributions. Both studies emphasize the key point that cities serve as the chief concentrators of capital, while the states represent the chief instruments of coercion. Given that I started with rebel cities, particularly significant for this inquiry is Tilly's discussion of the conditions under which rebellions or forms of popular discontent against the state have tended to start. Namely, this occurs when the state's demands and actions offended citizens' standards of justice or attack their primary collective identities, the first condition. The second condition, the people touched by offensive state actions were already connected by durable social ties. Third condition, ordinary people had powerful allies inside or outside the state. Fourth condition, the state's recent actions or interactions revealed that it was vulnerable to attack. I argued in my book that these conditions were met during the first Trump administration. Here is a graphic and grave example of the caging of children, how the sovereign offended social standards of justice. The polls showed that there was diminishing support for this kind of policy. The second condition, The undocumented refugees and asylum seekers and their families started to develop durable ties within the social community of the United States, and for this, dreamers are often cited as an example. Third condition, that urban political leadership, namely the mayors of American cities, had a stake in at least symbolically defending this population. And I won't read this speech, I will hold it for a few more seconds by Mayor de Blasio. And fourth condition, that the US national leadership was increasingly vulnerable to mounting opposition, including by the legal system, as evident in the San Francisco lawsuits, which prevailed in court to Judge Block's Trump effort to withhold money from sanctuary cities. Let us examine Tilley's conceptualization of the state versus the city in the context of migration, under which I studied the sanctuary movement. First, if we focus on the state, we can note the strengthening of coercive powers in the context of migration, the increasingly restrictive national regime in the United States, applicable not just importantly to Republican presidential regimes, but to mainstream Democratic representatives as well. In fact, I start the book with President Biden's June 2024 speech, refuting the ultimately successful 2024 presidential campaign rhetoric of President Donald Trump, who routinely referred to an invasion of illegal immigrants on the southern border and promised mass deportations if reelected. Then President Joe Biden declared on June 4th, 2024, and here is his speech. I will just read the first sentence: "I will never demonize immigrants." Yet President Biden spoke these words on occasion of issuing an executive order to close the southern border if a daily average of over 2,500 arrests was exceeded in any week, and to instruct border agents to refrain from posing outright manifest fear for their lives questions to asylum seekers. So there was a restrictive policy on occasion of which he uttered these words. President Biden went on to propose open door policies as well, for granting amnesty to undocumented spouses of American citizens, for providing work permits for DACA recipients, and in January 2025, for extending the temporary protection status for migrants from Sudan, Ukraine, El Salvador, and Venezuela. Following failed bipartisan legislation in Congress and facing political pressures during an election year, unfavorable polls on migration based in part on fears of community and demographic change, and discontent from local democratic leadership in overwhelmed sanctuary cities, President Biden still continued to rely on the same Immigration and Nationality Act, Section 212F law invoked by President Trump in 2017 to ban migrants from predominantly Muslim countries, and in 2018 to limit asylum claims on the border. In fact, in fiscal year 2024, under President Biden, ICE deported over 271,000 migrants, the highest figure since 2014, although President Obama holds the record of over 3 million removals during the 8 years of his presidency. That is the record after Eisenhower. While Tilley's first point regarding the states as the chief containers of coercion stands in the context of migration, I diverge from Tilley in part on the second point regarding the city. Notwithstanding the significance of concentrations of capital in cities, I argue for a new conceptualization of the city as a site of citizenship and rights claiming. Saskia Sassen's work has been particularly influential for this. Cities act as a strategic frontier zone, Sassen argued, for marginalized people. Urban spaces open the possibility to create new fronts of political contestation where those who traditionally lack power can carve out places within the city and make room for new political actors. The limits of urban citizenship are, however, clearer than its degree of expansion. Yet the key question is precisely how capacious urban citizenship can be for those at the margins of cities subjected to exploitation, eviction, discrimination, everyday humiliation, and to what extent it can offer them sustenance and concrete strategies for not just mere endurance of urban life with its economics of exploitation, but also strategies that can help them to be counted as political subjects with claims and substantive rights. Drawing from Kafui Atoch, who teaches here at the Graduate Center, I applied research lessons of the right to the city to sanctuary contexts. Particularly relevant for this research is the political conception of the right to the city. Atoch argues that the right to the city is coterminous with the rights of national citizenship, and that it is both a rebuke to restrictive conceptions of national citizenship and a form of active participation in political life of lived civil society in the city. So what can be learned from sanctuary organizing during Trump's first term? What has the study found regarding the sanctuary movement amidst the conditions of the restrictive state, but also given the new conceptualization of the city as a site of rights claiming? Let us first define sanctuary. Sanctuary can be conceived of as a small gesture toward alleviating human suffering and preventing humiliation, a gesture signaling reciprocity and co-presence of human beings vis-a-vis one another, asserted Elie Wiesel in his essay titled The Refugee. Rejecting the notion of sanctuary as a place, Wiesel argued instead for a living sanctuary of a human being whom nobody has the right to invade. My book shares Wiesel's humane, sheltering meaning of sanctuary and proposes to define it in modest ways as a set of social practices and networks of solidarity that affirm the human dignity of asylum seekers, refugees, and the undocumented. But the book also endorses a place-based, if not solely place-defined, understanding of sanctuary by examining migrants' claim for rightful presence in the city, and indeed their attempts at attaining the right to the city. Beyond the non-cooperation with ICE in the case of sanctuary ordinances, the book also offers a broader definition of sanctuary. It is seen as a resistance struggle and a means of interrupting the violence of the deportation machinery and its regimes of fear, emphasizing the role of radical solidarity of co-citizens, that is, citizens who partake in sanctuary practices with non-citizens. Evidence from fieldwork, as I will demonstrate, underscores the conceptualization of the city as a site of rights claiming that I have proposed. The subject here is thus not simply the sanctuary city per se, but the notion that the city can be viewed as a site of sanctuary practices and crucial networks of solidarity that hold the potential to resist immigration policies. And here are three understandings of sanctuary from my fieldwork that allow us to further contemplate these definitions. Sanctuary as a lived experience. As a friend noted, friend is the name for the undocumented asylum seekers that the new Sanctuary Coalition that I studied, that I'll talk about in a moment, uses. So I was invited to this group by a friend. I didn't suddenly open my eyes last year, that is 2016, when Trump was first elected. I lived through this process with my friend, this suffering. I experienced it every day. And further, sanctuary space is a safe place where one could place oneself in the shoes of those who suffer. Being able to see people in the same situation builds that confidence. As another friend asserted, and you have the translation in English, I will read in Spanish, todos somos seres humanos, solo pedimos la inclusión social después de la migración forzada, como esclavos modernos. These findings, revealing collective traumas of immigration and narratives demanding inclusion, are also suggestive of the political consciousness and social agency of the undocumented, thus challenging the notion that the precarious legal status means necessarily that they lack agency or capacity for social and political action. And I selected an image from a Jericho walk, which is a symbolic prayer walk around 26 Federal Plaza, location of USCIS offices. This is a walk that the coalition organizes. Sanctuary as accompaniment. The new Sanctuary Coalition provides accompaniment assistance that extends sanctuary to places where immigrants are being targeted for deportation. For example, the Federal Plaza downtown. Volunteers go with friends to court dates and bear witness to what is happening. We do not care about the circumstances of immigration. We recognize their humanity and we defend it. The amount of anxiety that people feel who go into the courtroom without a lawyer is enormous. Additionally, you realize that this is sanctuary. You're providing a space, an internal peace to go through something that is difficult. We emotionally and physically accompany people to go through that process so that they don't have to do it alone. We don't participate in the demonization of immigrants that dehumanizes people. And here is from one of the accompaniments. Here is a lady with a cane who was omnipresent in these meetings. Sanctuary as a legal clinic, one of the key activities of the NSC New Sanctuary Coalition that demonstrates the scope of the organization is the legal clinic. As one volunteer described, in the legal clinic, we help people who have someone in detention, negotiate legal fees, and reveal unfair legal practices. We assist family reunification, help victims of crimes. We can stop or slow down the deportation process. We don't just support the undocumented, we keep the system accountable. The judges know us. The ICE knows us, they fear us. They have blocked us from accompaniments, but we keep going. We show up to doctor's appointments, to family court, to lawyer's appointments, to Varick Street. And here is a vigil at Varick's in front of Varick Street Immigration Court that includes an act of holding hands against the wall and uttering the names of often deported friends or friends fearing deportation. So in terms of the critics of sanctuary and how my book intervenes in the scholarly literature, the book contests the findings of numerous scholars of sanctuary, and in the interest of time, I will highlight only Jennifer Begelman's critique of the notion that sanctuary cities in the UK offer a hospitable, even sacred remedy to the hostile top-down, explicitly punitive politics. In a really brilliant book, Jennifer Begelman argues that on the contrary, the sanctuary cities extend the unbearable weight asylum seekers endure, what she calls the suspended state. The suspended state highlights the experience of having to wait in the charitable zone of sanctuary. Immigrants are in fact embroiled in a process akin to pseudo-incorporation into the margins of society. Those who have had their refugee status rejected find themselves cast to the peripheries with no access to critical rights, benefits, and services. Where I am in accord with many of these excellent critics of sanctuary is with respect to the limits of sanctuary activism. And here I will highlight only Harold Bauder's work and Dominique Vitiello's work. So Harold Bauder stresses urban sanctuary policies and practices do not eliminate illegalization. They merely enable illegalized migrants to better cope with their circumstances of living in illegality. Thus, sanctuary cities fail to tackle the root problem caused by Westphalian statehood. In turn, while documenting the insufficiently funded resettlement of Southeast Asians, Dominique Vitiello found unjust, degrading, inadequate responses to migrants in destitute circumstances in decaying inner city neighborhoods that were also sites of racial violence. And Vitiello showed how acts of kindness and compassion were insufficient to, quote, overcome the fundamental structural limits and violence of the resettlement system. Before I give more evidence from fieldwork, I want to give a brief historical overview of the sanctuary movement. This was done by the New York Times this weekend in a long article. I don't know if you have seen it, but I thought it was a bit sketchy. So I could add a little bit to that. In contrast to the 1980s Central American sanctuary movement, which SM is the which responded specifically to the condition of refugees fleeing political violence in El Salvador and Guatemala. The new sanctuary movement, NSM, launched in 2007, switched its focus to illegalized migrants who have resided in and adjusted to quotidian life in the United States. Importantly, Vitiello again cites, and this is interesting sociological evidence, cites white middle-class backgrounds of sanctuary hosts in Philadelphia who assisted refugees of the early SM, Central American Sanctuary Movement, enabling access to decent housing and work. While migrants from the 1980s from Guatemala were able to settle in middle-class neighborhoods and locate decent jobs there, mostly in construction, landscaping, and housekeeping, migrants who arrived in subsequent decades tended to settle in working class and poor neighborhoods and did not achieve the same high wages, benefits, or workplace conditions movement because of their fear that providing shelter for immigrants would count as an illegal activity. Studying the movement in the early 2000s, she found that it lacked resources and networks and has in recent years encountered an even more hostile political climate, so much so that in 2016, the leadership feared the federal crackdown. Yet, President Trump's rhetoric during the first term in office also inspired a significant increase in immigrant rights organizations and the growth of the sanctuary movement. The NSM, in contrast to SM, was not an anti-war movement aiming at altering foreign policy, but rather a movement focused on broader human rights and more specific city and state policies. What is critical here, in contrast to the SM's attempt to merely shield or conceal immigrants, is the visibility and publicness of the NSM. Caminero Santangelo writes that the NSM might be seen as an effort to challenge the exclusion of the undocumented, partially by demanding that the non-citizens represent themselves via individual first-person accounts that narrate the trauma of migration, family separation, and life in fear of deportation. NSM uses stories of immigrants in sanctuary to increase awareness and strengthen activism. So I commenced my fieldwork trying to test my initial argument that sanctuary practices, even if symbolic, may hold the potential to challenge the exclusion, marginalization, dehumanization of the undocumented asylum seekers and refugees, overcoming their social isolation and even providing a critical link toward incorporation through empowerment and political participation in social movements. So an argument contrasting Begelman's and many of these critics of sanctuary. So in terms of fieldwork, I did participant observation with the new Sanctuary Coalition, selected because of its significance, prominence, and diligence with sanctuary work. This was a 1 year of fieldwork only. I studied resistance to exclusionary statist regimes and the criminalization of immigrants. During fieldwork, I attended dozens of weekly community meetings known as the Assembly, dozens of vigils at the Varick Street Immigration Court, Jericho walks, which was this symbolic prayer walk, and in front of 26 Federal Plaza, participated in sanctuary food efforts and accompaniments, conducted numerous unstructured discussions with the participants of the movement. In terms of and here is my experience, actually has been a walking through the city with members of this movement, so different from sitting in meetings. And this is one fleeting image from that experience. The new Sanctuary Coalition, in terms of findings, set out to actively oppose what it saw as the unfair, unjust, gratuitously cruel actions of a restrictive national regime that criminalizes undocumented immigrants. It proposed a different type of governmentality for such immigrants, regarding them effectively as citizens of the city with rights of protection, including going as far as to argue for the immunity that, quote, no one should be deported, which was prominently emphasized in one of their meetings. New Sanctuary Coalition sought to counter criminalization of migration and append the false binary of deserving/undeserving migrants through tactical inclusive efforts such as accompaniment and a variety of sanctuary practices that build solidarity network. As the fieldwork was being completed, I witnessed the NSC, or the New Sanctuary Coalition, struggling toward abolitionist practices, embracing the notion of expanded sanctuary, which would include a broader range of individuals who encounter the criminal justice system. The research findings uphold Sharpless's conclusions regarding the intertwining of the immigration enforcement regime and the incarceration regime, and show how sanctuary efforts contributed to the undoing of the deserving/undeserving immigrant, or more broadly, the deviant respectable narrative as a racialized system of control of Blacks and marginalized groups. This is further a critique of the racialized incarceration regime in a society that seemingly rejects otherwise present racism, although not necessarily an overt anti-immigrant sentiment, but encourages hatred of criminals. In the context of the criminal justice system, racism and anti-immigrant sentiments are linked. At one of the meetings, an immigrant seeking sanctuary emphasized that immigrants feel criminalized. Nos acusan de hacer un crimen si estamos sin papeles, but that they feel that the real crime is the separation of families. This point was also emphasized by Carmen de la Rosa, then Assembly member of the 72nd District, now the City Council representative for Washington Heights, who defended Amanda Morales Guerra, a Guatemalan mother of 3 seeking a physical sanctuary in Holyrood Episcopal Church in Washington Heights. And she called for the creation of un verdadero santuario, and you have the translations of these words on the screen. No podemos ser una verdadera ciudad santuario y un estado santuario si dejamos atrás las familias que están divididas. Tenemos que denunciar el odio que está teniendo lugar en esta nación. What I found in fieldwork was, on the one hand, distrust of the state, and on the other hand, linkages with local political leadership, as well as ambiguity regarding the role of local political leadership, who appeared as eager supporters of the sanctuary movement once the media placed provocative aspects of sanctuary in the limelight, including physical sanctuary, for example. It should be noted that one of the leaders of the coalition argued repeatedly that he did not have faith in either the political leadership or the legal strategies, but that he was counting on the community and community mobilization. Through their sanctuary practices and within their legal clinics, the NSC did not screen immigrants and refused to play the preference card that underlines the legal definition of a deserving refugee as a very limited understanding of the kind of immigrant who is entitled to support, although this may differ for the cases of physical sanctuaries for which model immigrants are more likely to be selected. In contrast to this, sanctuary participants construe the space of sanctuary as an open, safe environment that, according to Father Luis Barrios of Holyrood Church in Washington Heights, is intended to shelter not merely immigrants, but members of the LGBTQ community, heroin users, the homeless, sex workers, alcoholics, and even members of street gangs. Furthermore, this space facilitates a process of healing from the traumas of criminalization by providing a place where identity, culture, and parts of the self can be shared with others. The NSC, in fact, exited the entrapment of screening immigrants by acknowledging sanctuary as a transgressive space. The unique findings of this research are thus that NSC contested the deserving, undeserving distinctions and attempted to offer sanctuary to a broader range of individuals affected by the criminal justice system. Moreover, fieldwork results showed the effectiveness of the NSC accompaniment program strategy. According to organizers, numerous cases observed resulted in the slowing down of the deportation process. The presence of mostly native-born, overwhelmingly white, female, and middle to senior age New Yorkers was critical for the success of these cases. They strongly supported undocumented friends through their at times silent presence at ICE check-ins and in case of course hearings and at times vocal advocacy at the assembly. This is suggestive of NSC's successful attempts to disrupt the state monopoly on the legal, which an organizer referred to in another context as enforcing the line of rights, stating we are literally standing at that line and making sure that we hold the line and enforce immigrant rights. The research further finds a redefinition of sanctuary identity along political goals rather than those of religious conversion. So contra Jokic, with the state being the primary target of activism. Research finds a greater emphasis on the commitments of social justice than on religion in the sanctuary model. This does not deny that religious convictions may still serve as a motivator for involvement with some of the participants, but the movement appeared to me to be gaining political emphasis and political knowledge as well. And this is one image from Jericho Walks. At a meeting dedicated to the support for DACA program, people stretched out hands around the dreamer, and the organizer asked everyone to rebuild our society along the truths of justice, equality for all, noting that we stand in solidarity with the dreamers and their families, and then these moving words that they may feel those hands that care for them in every step that we take. May we say that we owe them as we owe to our parents and grandparents, that we may be able to give our love to the new generation, that they know our care, our generosity. The organizer completed these words by saying, may whoever God is to you give you support. At the next meeting, it was emphasized, we don't really care about faith, we care about justice. Interfaith leadership placed emphasis on social justice in other meetings as well. And this is from that meeting for support for a DACA recipient. And here is the lady with the cane there again. Sanctuaryhood that I mentioned, the NSC has created a project called El Barrio Sanctuario. According to a lawyer who worked for the coalition at that time, it was about people from the community explicitly claiming public spaces and letting ICE know that it is not welcome. ICE uses military equipment. Many are former soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan. We want to let them know that no one wants to talk to them. No one wants to help them. This is inverting the panopticon, letting them know that they too are being watched. This contrasts with the practice of immigration panopticism, which according to Chazaro eliminates zones in society where immigrant status is invisible and irrelevant and puts large number of public and private actors, including law enforcement and criminal justice officials, in a position of monitoring and determining immigration status, identifying potential law violators, collecting personal information from those individuals, and informing federal authorities, which is very mild to what is happening today. More on sanctuaryhood. As an organizer emphasized, sanctuaryhood should be in every spot, in every corner. That would make New York really a sanctuary city, which at the moment it is not. And I will come back to this point. At the moment it is not. Another organizer noted, our goal is to expand sanctuary beyond churches, which are critical as sacred spaces, but we want bodegas, delis, places where people go, beauty salons, barbershops, to know what they can do to protect people. And here is what we did while walking through Corona, Queens, distributing these Beyond Your Rights cards, how basically the undocumented would team up with a US citizen And here is an important point in terms of accessing businesses. They have the right to lock their door. ICE must have a warrant signed by a judge, not by ICE, right? Which is now being violated. This in terms of expanded sanctuary that I mentioned, according to Ravi Ragbir, the NSC leader would include an emphasis on not just immigrants, but women, the LGBTQ community, Muslims, people of color, and include an expansion of sanctuary beyond houses of worship to include schools, hospitals, and entire communities, as well as people who have come in contact with the criminal justice system. And this upholds Sharpless's conclusions regarding the movement for immigrant justice, aligning its messaging and politics with those of the racial justice movement to end hyperincarceration. This is following Black Lives Matter. Yet this movement, as we know, is constrained by difficulties in forming coalitions, given the competition for jobs, including in the public sector and for political power. I will now focus on the points regarding the rising political consciousness of co-citizens, which I think is one of the significant points of my book. What is apparent from activism during the first Trump administration is that citizens who joined to support non-citizens strongly opposed criminalizing migrants, gaining a type of political consciousness through demonstrations and protests that disposed them to uphold the rights of non-citizens through sanctuary practices such as accompaniment. Their vocal identification with not just the story of migration, but with their role as legitimate claimants within American urban democracy led these citizens to 26 Federal Plaza in Manhattan to support and represent, as it were, their migrant friends attending ICE appointments. Their proximity to immigrant neighborhoods, extensive contacts with immigrant friends, and perception of political opportunity structures residing in New York City's institutions, including the court system that could be open to migrant claims, all contributed to this support of citizens for non-citizens. For their part, the immigrants tended to see themselves as tentative residents, obviously not as criminals to be accused in court. A perspective of their rights being violated growing from their participatory practices in narrative reconstructions of the self in meetings. One of the immigrants cited above indeed came to see herself as the victim of a criminalizing, exploitative economic system that took her labor away without giving enough in return, treating her in fact as a modern slave. The immigrants' articulations of the social consciousness of their position, including in the economic system, thus contested the views of migrants as willing pawns in a neoliberal system. Their activism led NSC to consider a variety of coalition partners, from local political and faith-based leaders to groups opposing hyperincarceration. And with them, it struggled to expand sanctuary by forging links with the criminal justice reform advocates. Rejecting the deserving, undeserving dichotomy, NSC's abolitionist activism could be seen as offering an interpretation of American urban democracy that would be more open to those who strive to possess the right to have rights, from Hannah Arendt. This is Ravi Ragbir slide. Ravi Ragbir citation. And fieldwork in New York showed disruptive distinctions between the host and the guest, that is, between the volunteers and friends. Fieldwork findings posed strong challenges to statist politics, placing the emphasis on immigrant experience and immigrant solidarity, and indicating rejection of nationalism, rejection of the first Trump political regime in the United States, and even of borders themselves. And this is a very striking citation from fieldwork. This was when friends actually asked volunteers, why are you here? Why are you helping us? And this is what one of them responded to by saying, I left Iran in the 1980s. We crossed illegally. We were involved with immigrant solidarity work, helping other Iranians, Kurds, and working closely with Salvadorians in Washington. We are not obsessed with being an ideal American immigrant. When you eliminate nationalism, you have other values that take place, such as solidarity. Borders become nonsensical. Sanctuary is something very familiar, a place where we can create a community beyond the bureaucratic norms governing what an immigrant should be doing. Another volunteer explained, I grew up with the ideal of living in the US that is inclusive and equal. And if you're not hurting anyone, you would not be punished for what you cannot control. Most of my ancestors were Jews, and when I hear the way Donald Trump talks about immigrants, it reminds me of how dictators talked about us. I have a lot of immigrant friends, and I have come here to stop unfair treatment and deportations. The same linkage with immigrant history and further with US and transnational civil rights movements was claimed by Danis Rodriguez, who was then the City Council District 10 representative and now is a DOT representative. When discussing a physical sanctuary offered to Amanda Morales Guerra in Holyrood Church in Washington Heights, Rodriguez noted, Northern Manhattan is giving permanent residence to Amanda. We have been built by immigrants, and he lists. We are a progressive community that stands for the values of America. Amanda came from Guatemala, the land of Rigoberta Menchú, the indigenous leader. We are all Guatemalan now. This is Idanis and Camilo Del Rosa, together with Father Luis Barrios and another faith-based leader and a community member. In terms of how to theorize this, the particular concern here has been with the political potential of presence, here attributed to grassroots sanctuary activism in New York. This potential can further be seen as an embodiment of an expanded, strong democracy that enfranchises both citizens and non-citizens who participated in sanctuary practices. And this is my little homage to Benjamin Barber, who was my research supervisor, as Phil said, at the beginning of this process of writing sanctuary research. And sadly, he died in 2017, right at the beginning of this research. So what I took from Benjamin Barber was not his cool cities or when mayors ruled the world, but I took strong democracy and I expanded its meaning to include not just citizens, but non-citizens as well, as in this participatory vision, which is, according to Barber, dependent on, quote, active consent of participating citizens who have imaginatively reconstructed their own values as public norms through the process of identifying and empathizing with the values of others. And this empathy as a political force is something that Professor Marshall Berman used to talk about a lot. He was also one of my professors, because I took a class with him at the Graduate Center, and sadly, he's no longer with us also. The urban environment presents a complex arena of community building for the purpose of creating common goods, and this demands active citizens and non-citizens presenting claims on the city. If they don't have a standing to present claims on the state, they certainly have the claims on the city. In terms of the limits of political conceptions of a sanctuary, I wanted to steal these 2 extra minutes to add this, what I thought was really, really interesting from critics of sanctuary. The case for the politicized sanctuary should not be overstated. So in a brilliant account in Sanctuary in Pieces, Laura Madokoro chronicles the 200-year history of sanctuary in Montreal, finding it broken in pieces, exacting a cost on sanctuary seekers who encounter the hostile, inaccessible city, lacking hospitality and generosity. Madokoro's analysis reveals the complicity of oppressive forces of power and authority, the sanctuary itself emerging as, quote, deeply problematic historically in terms of dashed expectations, questionable motives, the fickle subjectivity of deservedness, the obfuscation of structural precarity, and the exposure to public scrutiny and added state controls. Similarly, in critiquing romanticized notions of fugitive democracy, Haro and Coles likewise show how abolitionist public practices whose, quote, substance and conditions of appearance hinged on vast networks and practices of concealment, largely autonomous community formation and creative law breaking, could not have transcended the horrific vulnerability and terror associated with illegality and potential capture. Very strong words. So the description of sanctuary practices in my book was not meant to deny the carceral aspects of church sanctuary seeking or the daily struggles to avoid deportation, to obtain shelter and employment, to access basic services, or to secure schooling for children. The examination here did not seek to pull back the shards of sanctuary, as it were. The broken accounts properly illuminate the limits of sanctuary, but by stark contrast, the expanded sanctuary brought into focus the bonds, however fragile, that hold citizens and non-citizens together in a mosaic of sanctuary practices. In terms of the shortcomings of sanctuary practices, I outlined these 4 trajectories, and you can read this. They are legality, publicness, visibility, and secularization. So they expose the limitations of the movement. On the emphasis on legal challenges faces the obstacle of restrictive immigration law and emphasizes individual cases. Public efforts such as sanctuaryhood must confront insufficient resources and inadequate civic infrastructure. Visibility places in the foreground the faces of dreamers and those in physical sanctuaries and relies on selective media coverage. Secularization is, however, indicative of the increasing strength of the movement to resist pressures of religious organizations to select worthy cases to support, yet support of churches is still critical in the cases of physical sanctuaries. What is left of the relevance of sanctuary does speak to the empowered subjectivities, I thought, of migrants who are offered more than just simple hope that they will not be deported. And they are offered by the sanctuary movement concrete assistance to achieve the goal of non-deportation, if not assistance towards resettlement absent federal, state, and city investments. In terms of the sanctuary policies, that is sanctuary ordinances and their shortcomings, distancing the NSC from the official New York City administration proclamations, a volunteer with the NSC claimed that the label sanctuary meant nothing. It was merely a brand. And he said, the city claims that it will not detain refugees based on their status, but by the very criminalization of the simplest infractions, such as jumping turnstiles, the city has tools to target individuals for deportation based on their race, ethnicity, or linguistic skill on the grounds that they broke the law. According to activists, this creates a contradiction between the meaning of sanctuary city and the grassroots practice that renders the label sanctuary city largely vacuous. So I disagreed with my informants. I think it should be noted that sanctuary ordinances are not always the empty proclamations that grassroots activists sometimes purport them to be. They can offer important institutional openings for an expanded sanctuary struggle, such as sanctuary campuses or police reform policies involving non-cooperation with ICE, or civil bureaucracies involving municipal IDs, or legal support in detention. So for immigrants in detention. So except in terms of the limits of these policies, except the case of mass protests, rebel sanctuary cities do not answer Harvey's radical and revolutionary call discussed at the beginning of this presentation. Rebel cities, it is true, have stood up to a hostile sovereign by contesting defunding in court, that is San Francisco, or by trying to forge global networks of mayors, as in the global parliament of mayors that Benjamin Barber was involved with. Yet lofty mayoral rhetoric during the first Trump administration signaled inclusivity as a form of right to difference. However, sanctuary policies in practice fell short. With the exception of Philadelphia, municipal ordinances and resolutions failed to involve immigrants in the sanctuary process, tended to highlight only immigrants' economic contributions, and more often than not had a weak record of shielding immigrants from abuses of due process. And Sharon Houston's work is particularly influential for this. So rather, it is the support of immigrants by social movements and local political activism that has been the key to creating participatory sanctuaries. In terms of implications for future research, I selected this really powerful quote. This is Juan Carlos Ruiz, the chief organizer with the NSC, who, reflecting on Amanda Morales' Guerra's case and on the DACA program, he uttered these powerful words. There is this sense of mourning. Our nation is mourning. We wake up with a dreadful feeling in our spirit, and I hope that we don't wake up from that, as that can cause us to look for decent human ways to build and engage with one another. We are in solidarity with many Amandas and many dreamers. We are in solidarity with, and this is a violent image, with those at the edge of a guillotine. If we can embrace that, we can embrace the opportunities that this brings. We need to mourn so that from whatever dies, a new life can spring up. And this reminded me of Kafui Atok's note on the right to the city, that it can be seen as a right against police brutality, surveillance, and state overreach as a crucial domain of the right to the city in the context of sanctuary cities. Another implication for future discussion, and this is a source pointed to me by Matt Block, Naomi Paik, who points to the fundamental duality of sanctuary policies, that on the one hand, they challenge the neoliberal state, on the other hand, they rely on its local government structures. And she emphasizes, indeed, many of us benefit from the systems that have not only dislocated people through economic and military violence, but also criminalize and sweep away others for our supposed security. We are thus bound to the dislocated, criminalized, and discarded, and we share a mutual accountability to build a different way forward. This understated conceptualization of shared citizenship is crucial for the understanding of sanctuary in the urban environment, where sanctuary practices can merge with other abolitionist struggles of marginalized groups. And among my concluding thoughts, I found what I was looking for, deeper grounded urban cosmopolitanism. I wonder what Phil would think about this. Although this point is made only implicitly, Fieldbrook endorsed the grounded urban cosmopolitanism of immigrants from Mexico, Honduras, Guatemala, Venezuela, and other countries whose ethnic belonging went so often unnamed and unuttered in meetings, vigils, or walks. And indeed, migrants did not make claims based on ethnic particularisms that critics of multicultural societies feared. Rather, migrants of different groups acted collectively, partaking in sanctuary practices with citizens and permanent residents who joined them in accompaniments, legal clinics, assemblies, sanctuary-hood efforts, demonstrating togetherness in struggles to fight deportation, apply for asylum, resolve legal liminality, or simply aid others. These co-citizens acted despite their differences amidst conditions of racialization, pressing an increasingly exclusionary state to uphold human dignity and defend human rights. It is not too far-fetched to suppose that Sanctuary Fieldwork witnessed a form of togetherness of co-citizens struggling to build a community of equality and human rights that advocates of grounded cosmopolitanism would hope for in New York. The New York City of the sanctuary movement during the first Trump administration thus affords a reflection of a deeper solidarity, which, to paraphrase Derrida, has indeed arrived, but perhaps yet needs to be recognized. This solidarity enfranchises co-citizens by reclaiming the right to have rights, countering the assumption that migrants diminish a polity, weaken cohesion, and merely seek economic incorporation. And in conclusion, if the right to the city hinges primarily on the undoing of the capitalist appropriation of space, grassroots sanctuaries fall short. But if transformative outcomes of social movements can plant seeds of change that grow over longer periods of time, sanctuary practices represent an important, if tiny, sprout, expanding and growing a democratic urban citizenship. The city selected here as the chief, although not only site of co-citizenship, would in theory contribute to the broadening of the restrictive national categories of belonging. The conditions of super diversity in New York City with its kaleidoscopic grassroots microcosms shape the grounded urban cosmopolitanism more durable than the fragile abolitionist sanctuary efforts that aim to resist criminalization and hyper-incarceration. And I promise to end with the rebel cities, revolutionary cities. According to Mark Basinger, who teaches in political science at Princeton and who studied urban civic revolutions around the world, he found that from 1985 to 2014, there have been 56 revolutions that have succeeded in overthrowing incumbent regimes. Another 67 revolutions failed to gain power. 2/3 of these revolutions occurred primarily in cities. Basinger notes that social revolutions entailing class upheaval or seeking to alter class relations have vanished, and he dates the last one of these to the Sandinista National Liberation Front in 1979 in Nicaragua. So, unlike David Harvey's hope for rebel cities, David Harvey, the new urban revolutions were less about social class and revolved instead around hostility toward the political class. In contrast to the social revolutions of the 20th century, they were motivated by grievances over property, redistribution of wealth, and land inequality. Recent urban civic revolutions responded to government repression, corruption, and misrule. And Basinger views cities as the sites where state powers are concentrated, its abuse is most evident. Perhaps we can end with a fieldwork starting point that sanctuary practices oppose a hostile state, but now this needs to be placed in the context that during fieldwork, many sanctuary participants did not necessarily oppose an unjust city, even if this remains an implicit point. Outrage at the federal regime, fearing the threat of stepped-up deportation and targeting of their leadership during fieldwork, sanctuary participants rarely aimed at expressing discontent with the urban inequalities and focused instead on the opposition to the federal government. And I wrote then, a national sovereign that has defaulted on the social contract and grown tyrannical, uninformed, and savagely cruel. What I would say now, I want that. The endorsement of sanctuary in this book comes with a warning. Indeed, as we have seen, sanctuary declarations called out offers of protection that can prove illusory. At the same time, one cannot argue that grassroots practices of sanctuary are sufficient either. Or however much grassroots practices might have succeeded in creating emancipatory sanctuary spaces through empowered subjectivities and the grassroots rhetoric of social justice, these practices nevertheless were insufficient to compel institutional responses to addressing urban inequalities. Sanctuary, I'm afraid, is not enough on its own.
Thank you.
This was interesting and inspirational.
I'm sure though. Oh. I'll take over. Thank you for this really engaging and timely talk, and I just want to open up the floor. Maybe I can also get the
Still is
screen.
back.
Oh, he's back.
You can next.
Why don't we, maybe see where the online audience is?
Yeah.
Okay.
Get them involved. Show them the cover of your book. You forgot the
Okay,
very
I forgot
important last
the
slide.
last slide, last slide, the Revolutionary City, yeah.
What
So-
press did
The
it come out
available
with?
Better Bookstores Everywhere sign has to come up at this point.
Okay,
And it was published by Cornell
Cornell University.
University Press, so. You wanna, yeah, why
How
don't
do
we,
we maximize this?
there you go.
Okay, here we are.
Hello. There's actually a question online. Why don't we start with that while you guys all collect your thoughts? Hello, I had a question. There we go.
Yes, of course, you can cite my presentation, but if you decide to read my book or at least glance at it, you will find much of this was in the book.
Cite the book.
Cite the book, you can cite the presentation, of course. I reworded it slightly and the Tilly discussion was not, it's actually in the middle of the book. I made it up front, so, and kind of thought about what would we say today? What are these 4 conditions today? Like, do we have an image as graphic and grave as the caging of children? You know, and what the polls are saying as well, yeah. So.
I just want to say hi to our online audience. My name is Els de Gras. I'm a faculty here in Political Science and International Migration Studies program. I think most people here know me, but welcome everybody. And so I want to open up the floor to comments and questions. And if you have a question online, feel free to unmute yourself or raise your hand or put your question in the chat. We'll keep our eyes out. So. I know some students here read parts of the book. So I'm curious if you guys have any questions.
Yes.
And introduce yourself, please.
Hi, I'm Caritas, a student at International Migration Studies program. I've been thinking a lot about, but I loved the chapters that I read of your book, and at one point you talk about militarization and like
Yeah,
defense of urban spaces, and I'm really interested in hearing more about that, especially, you know, we see the city as the site of contention, contestation, actually,
Mhm.
and with, you know, there's increasing budgets for things like hop cities where people are actually training military forces in like built cities around the US now. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you're thinking about militarization of cities in the context of sanctuary.
Yeah, this was in the 3rd chapter of my book where I talk about constraints or the limits of city sovereignty. And I decided when I was writing that chapter that I would outline these urban constraints, because what are the limits of city sovereignty? What are the constraints that we are facing in cities? And so I started with this, and I sadly anticipated this militarization of urban space that is now graphic and indeed incredibly disturbing taking place in LA, in Chicago, and promised in Memphis and other cities. Yeah, so this was a result of, and Stephen Graham writes a lot about this, the post 2001, so terrorist attack depictions, and how this impacted the changes in urban space and the increased militarization and control of urban space, and how this reflects the cost to social policies and social investment in cities. Instead, we are going towards securitization and militarization of urban space. And actually, when I wrote that chapter, I wrote it as an article for a journal, and the peer reviewers said, you cannot use the term militarization. This is too severe. You cannot use this term. And I kind of like decided to use it nevertheless. And I said, perhaps we could refer to this as militarization of urban space. And indeed, that took place under conditions that we are experiencing now under Trump too. Yeah, yeah.
There's
more
two questions online. So one is from Ferdinando. He says, how do sanctuary movements navigate the tension between legal liminality and political visibility, especially when visibility can invite retaliation?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And so there was a kind of an assumption on the part of the sanctuary movement activists during this time that I studied them, that their public presence, that their publicness will shield them, would work as a shield. So that they would be seen as an activist. And then Ravi Ragbir actually argued in court that that he was being specifically targeted for deportation because he was a public activist. So they used the publicness in a way, as a shield, because they would be perceived as publicly speaking, and then the courts could not unfairly target them for their advocacy. This would be the violation of the First Amendment. Yeah, so this is it's a great point, but it's a point also for the undocumented and asylum seekers who are a part of this coalition, whether becoming a part of the coalition would expose them and make them vulnerable. Actually, this was not really discussed in many of the meetings, even though people did feel empowered by participation. I found sense of increased political subjectivity, if you will, and people were able to articulate their condition in such stark terms that I thought was a sign of increased politicization, which gave them a sense of confidence, which they argued made them leaders. Yeah.
We have another online question from Caroline. She's like, what about New York makes it not a sanctuary city? Is it because of the sheer size of it? I would love to hear more about what challenges NYC goes through in limiting ICE invasions.
Well, I studied this during the first Trump administration, so I will focus my answer based on what I learned from fieldwork. But basically, activists wanted to distance themselves from the official city declarations. They felt that the city was criminalizing immigrants, in spite of declaring rhetorically that it is a sanctuary city, that this was this rhetoric. We can go back to this slide of Mayor de Blasio's powerful speech. But what did it really mean? It meant municipal IDs, and it meant some level of investment in the Department of Immigrant Affairs, but it did not mean the investment in like stopping the criminalization. And they felt that the criminalization of the smallest infraction, that is jumping turnstiles, made people vulnerable for deportation. And we can ask that question, whether someone should be deported over a misdemeanor. And yeah, certainly they felt that the city was criminalizing migrants and had the tools to criminalize migrants, and that it was claiming to be a sanctuary city only rhetorically, that it was a brand, basically. And I felt, however, that there were institutional opportunities. So New York, for instance, has this legal representation for immigrants in detention, which is a powerful tool, that is a powerful institutional opening that exists there. Municipal IDs can be used to access services. Else the ground knows a lot more about this than I do in the case of San Francisco. Yeah. So we don't have the healthcare kind of investment that there is in San Francisco that Elsa Grau writes about. Yeah.
Great questions. Questions here. I'll have a question if you don't mind. Thank you so much for a really great presentation. And so I wanted to kind of connect what I've recently read about the first quote unquote sanctuary movement, and kind of asking you to what extent that is relevant today. And so early scholarship, as you know, in the sanctuary movement really highlighted the role of non-immigrants in the sanctuary movement. Even though now there's revisionist scholarship that highlights the role of migrants, and even kind of transnational kind of influences on ways of organizing that people have brought with them, but also the role of immigrants, often not necessarily in visible places, right, in the movement. And so to what extent is what you're talking about, I know you've only done work in New York, but I assume you kind of are broadly familiar with what goes on in other places in the US, but to what extent is what you're talking about like a homegrown New York City kind of process or experience, or to what extent are there transnational influences or things that might also be going on in other places where there is an equally powerful coalition like the New Sanctuary Coalition? I'm not sure if you can speak to
Yes.
that, I'm curious.
Studying Philadelphia, Dominique Vitiello finds these connections, transnational connections, and he actually also studied expanded sanctuary. He sees expanded sanctuary differently, not in the way that I described it here, of
Mm.
the broadening the coalition to include those who have come in contact with the criminal justice system, but rather he sees expanded sanctuary for transcending borders and being a transnational movement and involving people from transnational locations and being this really border crossing movement.
Mm.
And that is tremendously important because it gives immigrant perspectives on foreign policies, on social conditions, on economic conditions, on environmental conditions that press them to migrate. And so there is that work in Dominique Vitiello's research. I did not find these connections. Matt Block can maybe talk about this because I know that he went to the border and he studied border movement, so maybe he can talk about this. But what you said at the beginning of your question, like that this was about the presence of citizens and the presence of permanent residents for advocates for non-citizens. I found that the meetings were actually mixed. There were both citizens and non-citizens in these meetings, which is not what Grace Yukich found in her
That's
book.
right.
She found that it was mostly the movement that had difficulties in recruiting actually the primary group, the immigrants, and that they were not joining the New Sanctuary movement as she studied it in the early 2000s. I found that it was a broad movement that included both the undocumented and so the new movement grew, and I wonder whether it is these four conditions that were met
Yeah.
you know,
yeah.
that in fact enabled the strength of this movement, that these are the conditions under which rebellions or forms of popular discontent against state start. And like once these conditions were met, there was a kind of a fertile ground for the movement to develop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have a couple of online questions. So Matthew, why don't you go first? Unmute yourself. If you have a video that you can turn on, would be great. Introduce yourself as well.
Sorry, I'm homesick with COVID. I wish I could be there tonight.
Okay.
So forgive me in advance. Matt Block, graduate student, PhD candidate at the grad center in sociology, also working on project on the sanctuary movement in New York from 2016 to 2023. So I'll try to be quick, which is not always easy given the material. Thank you, Vojislava. This was a beautiful presentation and reflective of really incredible work over years. I guess my question is, I mean, something that you and I has come up here and there, but not at great length, is, you know, in the presentation and in your research, one would think that, I mean, and even if in some folks' follow-up questions, the implication is that the New Sanctuary Coalition is doing this incredible radical work and growing steadily and consistently, you know, really pushing forward this radical vision, potentially really transformative vision, including confronting many of the challenges that have plagued the sanctuary movement for generations, including, you know, the deserving versus undeserving binary and the guest versus host binary and all of these kind of internal all of these sort of contradictions that have not been resolved and that seem to be being resolved in your writing, and yet we don't get to the point where, you know, soon after your research ends, the coalition, this organization collapses, right? I mean, it falls apart, it disintegrates, and it seems to be.
Oh, there is still the legal clinic. The legal clinic is still going. I get messages from them all the time.
Well, right. So, I mean, I know that the story obviously is.
Accompaniments are going through the variety of faith-based channels, including through what Juan Carlos is doing.
Totally.
You know.
Totally. No.
And I leave that. I wrote that I did not study organizational dynamics, the fact whether they paid their organizers, how much they paid them, what the gender dynamics were. I wrote that in the book. So I leave it up to you to talk about the organizational aspects of this coalition.
Well,
yes,
I guess the question
leadership.
I guess the question is just, I guess the question is just that if from the outside, it seems like there's everything is kind of coming together within the sanctuary movement, when in fact the collapse of the coalition, of the organization and of the coalition, would indicate that there are some really important tensions that are at play throughout this whole process, and that continue to be at play even up through even in spite of the successes. I'm not challenging in any way that these successes are real and significant and really powerful. And I wonder what you would say, where in this story are some of the internal, and I don't just mean internal within the organization, but even internal within the movement, maybe parts of the movement that are not grounded in the New Sanctuary Coalition itself. What are some of the tensions? What are some of the questions that activists, organizers, mobilizers are kind of trying to work out with each other, and getting at moments getting hung up, and at moments of maybe finding success? Did that come through?
Question, Matt. I felt basically that I wanted to focus on the year of fieldwork that I have done, and the fieldwork that I've done was participant observation, little Herb Gansian type of participant observation, little maybe perhaps old-fashioned participant observation, and I thought that I had written a more hopeful book than all the books that I have seen about sanctuary. And it stood out to me that in kind of rethinking these Tillich conditions, that these conditions were met, and at that particular moment that I studied it, 2017 through 2018, like I was able to find these signs of empowerment and these politicized subjectivities of migrants together with these co-citizens who strongly supported them. And so this is what I focused on. I wanted to write a book about that year. I didn't want to talk about, like, speculate what I kind of, that I stayed in touch and kind of peripherally observed what was going on afterwards. So I leave that up to you. I know that you have done 6 years of fieldwork, and I can't wait to see your book. So about that 1 year, that's what I wanted to emphasize. And it's a more hopeful account, and it challenges. I thought that it stands out, and I hope that people find it inspirational and that they can recuperate from what they had during this time. And yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for your question, Matt. I feel better soon, okay?
Thank you.
Chanel, I'm gonna turn the mic over to you. If you could briefly introduce yourself, that'd be great.
Okay. Hello, my name is Chanel Martino. I am probably the only foreigner in this room at the moment, but I'm all the way in Trinidad and Tobago in the Caribbean. So first, well, foreigner in terms of geography, but
Milena is connecting from Bogota.
Okay.
We're bringing the world together.
Yes.
Hello, Boshlitava. Congratulations. I very much enjoyed your talk. I'm very awed with everything you learned. Wonderful. Saludos de Bogotá.
Thank you. Chanel.
All right. So first of all, thank you for your amazing talk. It was wonderful. And the thing that was constantly in my mind as you were speaking was that sanctuary is itself juxtaposed with the state as like a coercive force. And my burning question usually is about the legitimacy of state action altogether, and whether you see your research as maybe providing an avenue towards investigating legitimacy as a whole. And I'm coming from that perspective just based on my location. We have many Venezuelan refugees at the moment in Trinidad and Tobago, and they are exploited when they come here. On the one hand, they have a safe space where they get to work or whatnot, but on the other hand, there's the whole legal regime against them, and people report them, people, get them involved in prostitution and human trafficking and whatnot. They're not paid the minimum wage, etc. And so I would like to know whether you see your research as an avenue for investigating the legitimacy of state action at all, and how we can expand, the concept of sanctuary towards the concept of legitimacy to maybe avoid that illegitimate action by the state?
Thank you so much for this question. This is amazing. And this is kind of what I dreamt of, adding these transnational perspectives to this. And indeed, the question of the legitimacy of the state. So I found that Sanctuary challenged the legitimacy of the state. I did not. So for instance, Begelman wrote this book in which she argued that the state is replicated in Sanctuary, that basically it's kind of this Foucauldian vision that it was directly replicated, that basically Sanctuary participants were in this suspended state of endless waiting for their cases to be reserved, and they were subjected
Absolutely.
to terrible exploitation, such as what you describe, and terrible abuse. And she found that there wasn't much empowerment to be talked about in terms of Sanctuary. Yes, so it's the work that I found was contrasting to that. I was looking for literature on the right to the city and right to claim rights, right to have rights in the city, so that the legitimacy of the city would be challenging this legitimacy of the state, and this would be challenging these broader national conceptions of citizenship. Rather, we would have this grounded. So I found this grounded urban cosmopolitanism where people were not making claims based on ethnic belonging, but were together participating in shaping this new urban polity. And yeah, so yes, definitely, that's read Begelman's book. You will find perhaps a lot of inspiration there. So it's contrasting, and then look at my book, see what you think.
Will do. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us, Chanel. That's amazing. And thanks for your great
Thank
question.
you for having me.
So, questions in the room? I have another question, if you don't mind. And so, when I think about Sanctuary, and you know this scholarship better than I do, but I think there's folks that are analyzing kind of government and governance questions, right? And then there's folks who look at kind of the movement aspect of it, right? And so you kind of position yourself, I think, being in conversation with a little bit of both, but and you kind of you portray Sanctuary in a different way that others have talked about it. But if I kind of zoom out, I'm like, okay, there's lots of scholarship on social movements, right? And so I don't know if you can reflect on this, but it seems to me, and I'm just playing devil's advocate here. And so I really like what you're doing with the book. I haven't yet read it, so feel free to put me in my place. But I also am thinking that this is what social movements ought to be doing, this kind of work. And so to what extent is the new Sanctuary Coalition and the movement it has inspired at the local level, to what extent is that social movement practices, like we would expect it, or to what extent is there something unusual about the way that the leaders of the movement engage with followers or try to engage followers? Does that make sense?
That's a great question. Kind of in thinking of, first of all, this first.
I know you have to look at, I'm not asking you about the whole.
Ordinances,
Yeah.
like that, there is a very lively scholarship on ordinances
Yes.
themselves. And there is Collingwood and Gonzalez O'Brien who study basically like relationships, quantitative, who have
Right, large end studies, yeah.
large and quantitative studies, like when an ordinance for sanctuary cities is passed, what happened in that city? Did crime increase or didn't it increase?
That's right.
Like that. And so there is a lot of research on that, but that research I felt entirely forgot this social movement that is also a part of important part of Sanctuary. So in terms of what they do that's so special, I felt they had organizers who were totally committed at that time. So Juan Carlos
But a
Ruiz,
lot of
who is
social
now-
movements have that.
who is now, yeah.
I'm
So-
playing devil's advocate here. I'm just trying to get a
and
sense.
there was on the, like, following Black Lives Matter, like there was this movement to expand Sanctuary to people who were impacted by the criminal justice system. So certainly there's been an impact of other social movements occurring at that period of time that impacted them. And we have Juan Carlos Ruiz stating that so many of the immigrants they're helping have had contact with the criminal justice system, and they have, like Ravi Ragbir, served his sentence for wire fraud, and have completely reconstituted themselves with this experience of leadership. And, you know, so there was that aspect of it. The sanctuary was a transgressive space. You know, I thought that was an important part of it, that it wasn't so much just only about what sanctuary used to be, helping these nuclear families, helping families who have come from because they experienced political violence. But this was about a broader range of individuals, and they tried to recruit me for Ukrainian LGBTQ struggles, for instance, not knowing where I was from. They were very outgoing in terms of involving people with whatever background they come from and then the legal clinic, I thought, played a really fantastic role in helping people fill out their asylum applications, and people have tremendous fear and tremendous uncertainty and cannot often articulate how to fill out these asylum applications. So there were many different fronts of their struggles. I think that's what it was. It was accompaniments, it was assemblies, it was the Sanctuary Hood effort, which was the smallest of these efforts, and I was the most impressed by it in some ways, because it's like, what happens if there is an ICE raid in a neighborhood? And we were walking through the neighborhoods of Corona, Queens, and giving out these flyers, and people were taking them on and saying, well, okay, if ICE comes here, here is what could happen, and here is, you should ask for a warrant. And they were just looking at us and taking out these flyers and saying, okay, maybe we'll put them in our business, you know. And certainly now, you know, this would be the time to do it, you know. And as Maz is saying, the coalition is no longer there in terms of the kind of infrastructure that it had set in place in 2017, 2018, when I studied it. Yeah. But certainly the fact that they had so many different efforts, and these faith-based inspired efforts, such as the Jericho Walk and the vigils, were very powerful in a way. And they were sometimes attended by hundreds and hundreds of people, like walks around 26 Federal Plaza. And so this whole idea of kind of like that the symbolism of the peaceful resistance would crumble these walls, you know. So that people felt for that. And, you know, this is the kind of, I felt that the movement was very politicized, but there was also this motivation of faith-based movement that was there. These vigils, when they uttered the names of friends holding their hands on the wall of Varick Street Community Court, which was a smaller effort, but people felt very, very, like, they were very emotional. Like Grace Yukich, for instance, found that individuals were unemotional, that they were learning how to present themselves by the new sanctuary movement. In fact, they were very emotional, and openly so, in this movement that I observed.
Thank you. Andrew, you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Andrew. I'm an undergrad student over at Baruch, and Professor DeGrow is my advisor for my honors thesis, which happens to be in migration studies as well. Thank you. I think that you made a really important separation between the social movement and the statehood of the sanctuary statehood, because that delegitimization of New York City as a sanctuary, to me, was surprising, because we have things like not financial aid from the federal government, but from the state, for dreamers and or students that are undocumented and things like that. That I do find pro New York City being not a label only, but an actual state of sanctuary. But talking more about the movement, the social movement part, did you encounter any the role, like the relevance of labor unions within the sanctuary movement in New York City at all, or do you not see them?
I did not, actually, I did not. I don't know if Matt, who has done longer term, like a longitudinal study, can I call it, Matt, a longitudinal study at this point, you know, longitudinal study of the sanctuary movement. But what you said about the dreamers was really important, because I distanced myself from this proclamation that actually it's completely vacuous, this term sanctuary city as a sanctuary ordinance.
But maybe following up on Andrew's question, you know, you were really involved with the movement. What can you tell us about who kind of in the ecology of other organizations or individuals in the city were they networked with, or were there allies? You know, they weren't all by themselves. They had, you know, I assume partners in crime. And so who would that be in New York City?
They had, I am not exactly sure. I know that one of the organizers told me that they were trying to have a link with even an anarchist organization. So it ranges from that, to the DSA, and then to the NYU resources that they were tapping into.
Yeah,
I don't know in terms of their linkages with Make the Road, so I don't know if Matt knows.
were they clued into churches, faith-based
But-
institutions?
I think
Certainly
that's, yeah.
a broad network of faith-based institutions throughout the city. This Holyrood Church in Washington Heights played a powerful role.
Okay.
And then now it's the Church of Good Shepherd in Brooklyn, right, Matt?
Well, no, I mean, now that was a couple years ago. I mean, that was as of 2023. Now the landscape has shifted again. But yeah, I would say definitely the New Sanctuary Coalition, historically from 2007 when it was founded, really saw itself as bringing together mostly faith-based communities, so congregations, churches, synagogues, other houses of worship. They were not good. They really viewed themselves as doing something that couldn't be in coalition, or at least not in equitable coalition with other immigrants' rights or other kinds of organizations, which was one of the things that made it most difficult for them to kind of grow and sustain over time. They had better luck, at least in the short term, serving as a coalitional center of congregations, but even that became tenuous, given the kind of power dynamics that
That you
movements
observed.
so often suffer from. So
But
anyway,
there was, remember Angela Fernandez from the Northern Manhattan Immigration Coalition, and then their linkages with political leadership, very importantly, who showed up once the physical sanctuary started in Washington Heights of Amanda Morales Guerra. So the linkages ranged from political leadership to especially faith-based leadership, and then to some smaller organizations that I think organizers individually tried to expand these efforts with.
those were more ended up being more geographically based than they were organizationally based, and actually in each of the geographic regions where they were focused ended up being based far more in local organizational cultures than they were in the and the identity and the explicit relationship with the New Sanctuary Coalition vanished in those in each of those sites, which was okay with some of the organizers, and actually some of the organizers encouraged that as a way to decentralize the movement, as a way to ground it more locally in the experiences of very specific kinds of ethnic and class-based linguistic communities. But in other cases, there were leaders of the movement who were deeply opposed to that kind of decentralization, and that was one of the tensions that I was sort of hoping, maybe among others, that might come up, because I think that some of the if the sanctuary movement is going to be able to grow and be successful again, I think we need to think about what are some of the things that sort of challenged its rise the first time, which was incredible, as you've brilliantly articulated.
Thank you, Matt.
Matthew, you had your question up earlier. Did you want to add on to this, or is it reflected in your comment?
Well, I
that you
was just
typed?
going to respond to what you were saying, with your question about how sanctuary movement is different from other social movements. And I think I'm not sure if you meant the sanctuary movement as a whole or in New York City. But one of the things that I found that I've kind of been orienting my project around is the way in which the sanctuary movement works to integrate what Jasper describes as citizenship and post-citizenship movements in ways that one might otherwise think would be incompatible. So whereas citizenship movements aim to, and Naomi Paik writes brilliantly about this in a couple of her articles and her book, whereas the logic of citizenship and orienting towards a citizenship movement would aim to increase inclusion and aim to open up inclusion to greater numbers of people. Post-citizenship movements challenge the very basis of citizenship as a legitimate form, as a legitimate ground principle to ground the political community, particularly because of its inherent logic of inclusion through exclusion, as Agamben might say. And so I think the sanctuary movement is like on this hinge where it's simultaneously trying to assert that people have, you know, whether it's deservingness or, you know, welcome or whatever the language, or being, you know, hosted as stranger as God, or whatever, however it's framed. They're trying to simultaneously strengthen the logic of citizenship by saying we should be including everyone in not deporting anyone, but simultaneously saying we're working towards a political community that is not grounded on exclusion, period. And as a result, not grounded on inclusion either.
That
And
that was negotiated on the level of the city was really interesting. Because
exactly,
that's like this claim of kind of right to the city is a claim to would be the kind of post citizenship claim in a way, but it's also a claim that enhances and alters the citizenship as it is, you know, so it includes that tension that you were talking about. So I was focusing on the city as a
Totally.
kind of, where this is being negotiated.
totally. And the ways and the challenges then with how, when people, you know, in certain cases, people will say, you know, will claim the city as, you know, to challenge the state, to challenge citizenship. But in other cases, the city ends up becoming too much of an institutionalized, sort of bounded
Exactly.
entity
But the
itself.
city as a site of social movement, the city as a site of rights claiming. So that city,
Exactly.
not the city as a government institution per se.
Totally.
Yeah.
I hope, by the way, you guys will co-author at some point.
Yeah,
Your
yeah.
expertise together.
We have to, Matt has to
Yeah.
hurry up with his book.
I know, get your dissertation book done.
Working on it now.
Any other questions or comments? No? Well, then, I think we're gonna wrap up. Thank you so
Thank
much,
you.
Borislava,
Thank you.
for a really great. Your book came out when?
September 2025.
So it's a really new book available at Cornell University Press. So I just got my copy in the mail about 2 weeks ago. So I'm looking forward to reading it. Thank you all for being here, both in person and online. If you found us, you know that there's more talks coming up. I'm forgetting exactly when they are. Do you know? I'm looking at Phil.
It's Felice Garrett.
Felice Garrett is up in November 18th is our next talk.
4:15. Felice Garrett from Princeton.
And our third talk is December 9th, I know,
That's right.
by Bernadette Ludwig, who is actually also celebrating a new book that comes out that day. And she's going to talk about Staten Island and how Staten Island has dealt with refugees, Black refugees, but I'm forgetting the title of the book. But anyway, thank you all for being here. And again, thank you so much.
Thank you for
your
inviting
talk.
me. Really on.
Hey, feel free to partake in a little bit more of the food and drinks and mingle with the author presenter if you want.
Thank you for those online.
Thanks,
Thanks,
Mariela.
Vojislava.
Thank you. You're missing this food here. Sorry.
Feel better,
Save me a glass of wine. I'll be there soon.
Matt, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your comments. Thank you.
Take care.
Thank
Be
you.
well. Talk soon.
No, you
Didn't have more.
No, not at all. It was, the folks were also really powerful.
Yeah. And then as Matt said, they splinter after this, but I didn't study that.
That's okay. That's
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Leave it for someone else to
Yes,
cover.
research, 1 year. Yes.
No, you already have, if you went to, you said a dozen meetings a week. Yes.
Not dozen meetings a week, but dozens of meetings.
dozens
during
of
the
meetings.
one year. If my.
Oh, okay.
my-
No,
my
but it's
grammar
still,
probably-
that's a lot of meetings, so.
I was everyone else prepared. I was just so what is going on. I discussed with you after
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Okay, so this should be helpful because.
I take up notes so extensively. This was fantastic. Thank you so much.
So it should be enough for class is very different, but you know.
Fantastic. I think I was just really so excited. I forgot to ask you anything at that moment. But is this your first time here? Have you presented?
I've never presented here. I was here in the audience listening to different presentations over many years.